Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Open Line. I'm Carrie Sharp. Really a fascinating topic to discuss over the next hour and really learn a lot more about human trafficking. And I have the premier expert in this state with me. Margie Quin is our guest tonight. Thank you for being here. Let me introduce you a little bit to Margie. She is a professor and director at Cumberland University now, but just retired from the TBI. And you have really spent a good portion of the last decade or so shaping our policies, shaping our laws when it comes to human trafficking in this state.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about a subject that I feel very passionately about. While I am retired from the TBI, I still are very active in the criminal justice process and system there at Cumberland University. But I'm excited tonight to talk a little bit about what In Slavery Tennessee is doing for the victims of trafficking and maybe to dispel some of the myths that are out there.
I think there are probably a lot of myths that we can just tick off throughout the next hour. This is Open Line, so it's always your chance to call in and ask your questions. If you're like me, you probably have a billion of them when it comes to human trafficking. Like, what is it and what do these victims look like? And does it really happen here? We're going to get to all that, but always first, if you have a question, we're going to take your call before my question. So 615-737 is the number to call. In the meantime, while we get those calls set up, I'm going to ask the questions for just a little bit. And let's start with, what is human trafficking?
That's a great question. And the way I like to define it is just the legal definition, because I think that's the simplest way to go about it. Trafficking occurs when a person is over the age of 18, engages in a commercial sex act by means of force, fraud, or coercion. So you have over 18, a commercial sex act, force, fraud, or coercion. When the person is under 18 and engages in a commercial sex act, the government does not need to prove force or fraud or coercion, just that a commercial sex act occurred. That is human trafficking. The law does not distinguish between a willing victim as a minor. And the code also defines a commercial sex act as a sex act that occurs when something of value is exchanged. So that's not necessarily money. That could be apartment rent or drugs or shelter. You know, any one of those things in exchange for a sex act makes it a commercial sex act, and that's how it ties into trafficking.
So who are the victims in Tennessee? Can you give me a snapshot?
They're really everybody. I think there are a lot of myths out there that this is a foreign national problem, that this doesn't happen to children from Tennessee or young women from Tennessee. And I'm going to talk probably in generalities about women and young girls, but we do believe that trafficking occurs to young men maybe 10 to 15% of the time. So it's not
that's higher than what I thought it would be.
Exactly. It's not exclusively women, but generally it affects women and children disproportionately. And so that's kind of where we
sit right now.
Yes.
How did you become so involved with this?
So in 2010, the General Assembly passed a public chapter, and they called for this comprehensive study on human trafficking, because I think the legislature, the General Assembly, they wanted to pass new laws. They felt like we needed some additional legal infrastructure, but they just weren't sure how much was occurring here. And so they asked the TBI to conduct that research, and I led the research team, which we partnered with Vanderbilt Center for Community Studies. We produced the first ever statewide assessment on human trafficking in the United States, and what we found is that trafficking is occurring in about 85% of Tennessee's counties, and that was a kind of a 24-month snapshot back in 2009, 2010. So once we produced those results, where we really felt like we had a good understanding of where it was happening and how much it was occurring, then the General Assembly got real busy and they started passing laws, and that vaulted Tennessee into the #1 ranking by Shared Hope International for the laws that we have on the books to protect children from things like trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation.
Are there areas, you said it's happening in 85% of Tennessee, but I wonder if there are certain areas within certain counties that fall victim more often, or where people fall prey to this scenarios?
There's no single one common denominator. In 2014, the TBI followed up that original report with a report called the Geography of Trafficking in the state, where we looked at the 25 counties in the state that had the highest numbers of minor human sex trafficking, juvenile sex trafficking. And what we found is that the vast majority of those counties were rural counties, counties with less than 50,000 population. And so we started to look at what were the common denominators between all of these counties. What were the common denominators of the victims and the survivors who are presenting to social services, to law enforcement, wherever they bump up into the system? And what we began to see was a general profile of victims. They can be impoverished. They can have drug addicted parents, or parents who are heavy drug users, lots of domestic violence in the home potentially, children with early childhood abuse. That's a very common denominator. But ultimately, it's something that makes a child or a young woman vulnerable. And that vulnerability then becomes exploited by a trafficker to a great extent, and that's really the common denominator. It's some sort of vulnerability at the base.
I really want to bring this home to people that this is happening here. It is happening in neighborhoods in our communities. Can you tell me some personal stories that you've been involved in?
So I think we were very surprised. In 2015, the legislature gave the TBI 4 additional special agent positions to just work human trafficking. And so we dispersed those across the state in Knoxville, in Chattanooga, in Nashville, in Memphis, Jackson area. When I retired from the TBI in January, we had over 95 trafficking cases open just by those 4 agents. We ran about 12 massive undercover operations all across the state. And what surprised me was the demand side of the crime, how prolific the demand side of the crime was, how many men are calling ads on the internet. There were so many women that also came through our operation. In slavery Tennessee, statistics right now are that 67% of the survivors that are coming into their services are opioid addicted. So that intersection between drug addiction, opioid addiction, and trafficking is through the roof.
I want you to set me straight here, because as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, okay, well, how is someone who's being trafficked different than maybe perhaps a prostitute?
Right. And we find the lines are so blurred between prostitution and trafficking. Anytime you have violence or coercion associated with a commercial sex act, so if a woman is independent, nobody's controlling her, it is possible she could be trafficked by a John. Sure. If she experiences violence at the hands of a buyer. But it's a rare occurrence when there's not violence or coercion associated with a pimp, between a pimp and a prostitute. So there's very little difference. And what we were telling law enforcement when we train them is that we have to know the difference. We have to understand what questions to ask a victim or a woman, so that we can determine whether or not we're dealing with a trafficking victim or we're dealing potentially with someone who has committed the crime of prostitution. So
what would those questions be? What are you asking?
We're asking things like, who's taking care of you? Where are you living? Do you have a boyfriend? Does this boyfriend know what you're doing? When we're involved in operations, it's a lot of questions about how this person is living, how they're existing, how did they get into this, when did they start? Most women, even adult women, will tell you that they started as juveniles.
Sure. Yeah. As a reporter, gosh, almost 20 years ago now, when I would cover the court systems and the arraignments on, 8 o'clock, Monday morning, you're in arraignment court, and often police would set up these, prostitution stings. And you'd have the Johns that would be brought in, and then you'd also have the women being brought in. They'd be charged and go through the system, and that was it. But you're saying that is probably changing a lot now, 20 years later, about how these women are being treated. It's not
I think it's changing all for the better, right? When you look historically at the numbers of women who are arrested in this triangle, right? This facilitator, this buyer, this this woman in this triangle. She's only 1/3 of the 2/3 of this triangle. And so, but historically the numbers were so lopsided with the number of arrests made on women versus the number of arrests made on buyers or the pimps or promoters. So we're trying to upend that. We're trying to level that playing field. We're trying to increase the risk on the buyer side and the promoter side so that it becomes a much more risky crime to commit. As long as you have a low risk, high reward scenario, it's going to be hard to make a dent in that. And we see women going through the system like a revolving door.
Over and over again.
They're being arrested 50, 60, 70 times. And the numbers that TBI keeps, the Tennessee Incident-Based Reporting System, are just incredibly lopsided. 1,400 arrests of women, 100 and something arrests of the buyers. So we're trying to flip those stats. We're trying to at least equalize those stats so that law enforcement is targeting each of these corners of the triangle.
Why is it so important to change the story for these women?
Because I think they matter. I think even if you want to believe, or you think you believe, that women choose this, and women don't choose this. This is not something women choose. Even if you believe that, I think these women don't have to do this for the rest of their lives. And I think if given good options, good choices, if you can solve the drug addiction problem, if you can provide options for them, most are going to take it.
Tell me about In Slavery Tennessee.
They are one of the big 4 nonprofits in the state that are part of this now new Tennessee Anti-Slavery Alliance. They operate here in Middle Tennessee. They are the biggest nonprofit in the state that are providing direct resources to victims of trafficking. And so they have a very comprehensive service array. And we call that sort of a single point of contact model, so that you have one person, one caseworker that's organizing or working on all the services, whether it's medical, educational,
workforce, I'm sure.
Workforce, dental, drug addiction, counseling. Obviously, there's a lot of complex trauma associated with this. So they're providing all of those things free of charge, safe houses, and they have seen a 350% increase in the last couple of years in the number of referrals.
Amazing.
It's amazing. It's both a good thing,
right, and
a bad thing.
Yeah.
Right. It's a good thing because we are, as a state, beginning to identify trafficking victims and bringing them into services, much needed services. And we're very fortunate to have the 4 nonprofits that we do, and we're extremely fortunate to have In Slavery right here in Nashville.
So I imagine our first responders, our police officers out there on the streets, are really the first people who come in contact with someone who possibly is being trafficked. And when they pick up the phone and call one of these 4 nonprofits, then what happens?
So in some cases, they're already out there with us. So when we're running these major undercover operations, they are already out there on scene with us.
Makes sense.
And the female survivors are going to go see them first. About 30% of the women that come through these operations are taking services at the point of contact, which is amazing. About 10 to 15% are going to call us in the weeks or months after that, which is fantastic because there's no expiration date on the offer, right? Whenever they want to come in, they can come in. There are other things like the trafficking court here in Davidson County, a real tremendous thing here. Cherished Hearts, run by the DA's office here. In Slavery is very involved in that. If the Department of Children's Services restores or rescues a juvenile victim of trafficking, within 24 hours, they're calling the TBI and they're calling In Slavery. So In Slavery is providing counseling support, expert counseling support in places like Hermitage Hall and G4S, where juveniles are in secure facilities because of other status offenses. But you cannot ignore the women or children who are incarcerated as a result of other crimes or status offenses committed while being trafficked.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that in a second, but let's hop to Wayne, who's on the line. Wayne, thank you for calling in. What's your question tonight?
Yeah, thank you for the time.
Sure.
An observation, when I go to grocery stores and see all these pictures of missing children, it's been going on for over 10 years, and it's kind of frustrating. I'm just wondering, is this part of human trafficking? Are the kids missing because they're being abducted? Can anybody explain where they are?
Yeah, great question, Wayne.
Thanks, Wayne. So in the state of Tennessee, there are between 600 and 900 children reported every single month.
Missing?
Missing.
600 to 900?
600 to 900, because I was over the Missing Children's Clearinghouse for about a decade at the TBI. So about 50% of those are runaways. It is not that sort of Taken scenario like the movie where you think somebody's been kidnapped or This is sort of much more insidious. The missing children that you see on posters and things like that, some are runaways, some are non-custodial parent abductions, which people tend to kind of blow off, but they shouldn't. Non-custodial parent abductions are very serious, and we should take them very seriously. Yeah. It sort of runs the gamut. There is a research entity called NISMART. That's an acronym. It stands for National Incident Studies for Missing, Abducted, Runaways, and Throwaways.
Wow, okay.
They're the most quoted studies in the world with respect to the commercial sexual exploitation of children. And what NISMART tells us is that within 48 hours of a run incident, 1 in 3 children are approached for the purposes of commercial sexual exploitation or trafficking.
Wow, 33% of kids.
Yes, so in the state of Tennessee, if you put those numbers to the 600 to 900, 50% are runaways, that's about 1,400 kids a year in the state of Tennessee who are at risk for commercial sexual exploitation just by virtue of being a runaway.
And that is because someone is out there saying, I can offer you shelter, I can offer you food, clothing, money, drugs, whatever.
Right.
I'm going to take care of you, but here's what you got to do.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, great question, Wayne. I hope you got your answer there. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, more of your questions. We have a few lines open. If you want to call in during the break, we'll get you set up. 615-737-PLUS is the number to call. Stay with us.